London, 1854. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets of Mayfair as Lord Kieran Ivingston, the 7th Earl of Harrowby, stared grimly at the papers spread before him. The candle beside his desk had burned low, testimony to the hours he had spent poring over the accounts. His father's debts were worse than he had imagined. 3 estates mortgaged to their limits, creditors circling like vultures, and the grand Harrowby house itself at risk. "My lord," his solicitor, Mr. Willoughby, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I must be frank. Without an immediate infusion of capital, you have perhaps 6 months before the creditors force a sale." Kieran ran a hand through his dark hair, loosening it from its careful styling. At 32, he had not expected to inherit the earldom for many years yet. His father's sudden death from apoplexy had thrust him into a position he had been ill-prepared to assume. The discovery that the late Earl had been gambling away the family fortune for the past decade was an unwelcome revelation. "And my options?" Kieran's voice was low, controlled despite the turmoil within. "There are but 2, my lord. Marriage to an heiress, or the gradual sale of the family holdings, beginning with the art collection." Kieran's jaw tightened. The Harrowby collection had been amassed over generations, portraits by Reynolds and Gainsborough, landscapes by Turner. To sell them would be to erase his family's legacy piece by piece. "Marriage then," he said flatly. "Though I confess I have little patience for the marriage mart and its parade of giggling debutantes." "Perhaps," ventured Mr. Willoughby carefully, "a widow of means. Someone more mature, seeking position rather than romance." Kieran nodded absently, already dreading the charade ahead. He rose and moved to the window, watching as London's fashionable set began their morning calls. A title for fortune, it was hardly an uncommon exchange. But he had hoped for more from marriage. A companion, perhaps. Children, certainly. The Harrowby line needed an heir, and his father's recklessness had made that necessity all the more urgent. "Very well, Willoughby. Make discreet inquiries. I require a wife with sufficient fortune to save Harrowby, preferably one who understands this is a business arrangement, nothing more." What Kieran didn't say was that he had long ago abandoned the notion of marrying for love. That luxury had been denied him the moment his father had placed the first bet. 20 miles away, in a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village of Fernbrook, Miss Catherine Fairchild pressed her forehead against the cool windowpane and watched the landlord's carriage depart, his ultimatum still ringing in her ears. 1 month to pay the accumulated rent, or she and her young sister would be evicted. "Is he gone, Cathy?" came a small voice from the doorway. Catherine turned, composing her features into a reassuring smile for her 12-year-old sister. "Yes, Margaret. Mr. Thistlewood has departed." Did he agree to wait for Papa's investments to mature?" Margaret's eyes, so like Catherine's own deep blue, were wide with hope. Catherine swallowed hard. Their father had been dead for 3 years, his investments revealed as worthless papers. She had maintained the fiction that they were simply delayed, unable to bear destroying Margaret's last connection to their father. "Not exactly, dear. But don't worry. I have a plan." It was a lie. Catherine had no plan beyond selling her mother's remaining jewelry, which would scarcely cover a quarter of their debt. At 26, with no formal education but the accomplishments expected of a gentleman's daughter, her options were severely limited. She could become a governess, but what of Margaret? Her sister was too old to accompany her into a household as a nursery maid, yet too young to be left alone. They had no relatives willing to take them in, not after their father's disgrace. Catherine moved to her writing desk and pulled out the morning's newspaper. The employment section offered little hope, seamstresses wanted, her needlework was barely passable, companions to elderly ladies, who would not welcome a young sister, and, at the bottom of the page, an advertisement that caught her eye, widow sought as wife by gentleman of title. Must be of gentle birth, proper deportment, and independent means. Discretion assured. Apply to box for 17, London Gazette. Catherine's fingers trembled as she traced the words. A gentleman of title seeking a wife through an advertisement, it was scandalous, desperate. As desperate, perhaps, as she was. But she was no widow, and she certainly had no independent means. Yet the advertisement sparked an idea. A terrible, risky idea that could either save them or destroy what little reputation she had left. Margaret approached, peering over her shoulder. "What are you reading, Cathy?" Catherine folded the paper quickly. "Nothing important." "Now, shouldn't you be practicing your pianoforte? Miss Amberley will be most disappointed if you haven't mastered that Beethoven sonata by your next lesson." As Margaret reluctantly moved to the instrument in the corner, Catherine retreated to her bedroom, mind racing. She could pose as a widow, the right clothing, a somber demeanor, a carefully constructed past. As for the independent means, perhaps she could imply an inheritance forthcoming, delayed by legal complications. It was dishonest, potentially ruinous, but what choice did she have? The alternative was the workhouse, or worse. For Margaret's sake, she had to try. Sitting at her dressing table, Catherine studied her reflection. Her face was too young for a convincing widow, but grief aged one quickly. Her dark hair and fair complexion had once been called beautiful, before poverty had hollowed her cheeks and dulled her complexion. Still, with careful presentation. She opened her jewelry box and removed her mother's wedding ring. It was the one piece she had sworn never to sell, her last tangible connection to the woman who had died giving birth to Margaret. Now, it would serve a different purpose, evidence of a marriage that had never existed. "Forgive me, Mamma," she whispered, sliding the ring onto her finger. 1 week later, Catherine sat rigidly in the drawing-room of Harrowby House, her borrowed black bombazine dress itching against her skin. The fabricated identity she had created, Mrs. Catherine Fairchild, widow of Lieutenant James Fairchild, killed honorably in the Crimea, felt like a mask that might slip at any moment. She had responded to the advertisement with a carefully crafted letter, hinting at a modest fortune tied up in investments that would mature within the year. It was a dangerous lie, but one that had secured her this interview with the mysterious titled gentleman. What she had not expected was the man who now regarded her with cool assessment from across the room. Lord Kieran Ivingston, the Earl of Harrowby, was not the elderly, desperate nobleman she had anticipated. He was perhaps in his early 30s, tall and imposing, with keen grey eyes that seemed to penetrate her carefully constructed facade. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said, his voice deeper than she had expected. "I appreciate your prompt response to my advertisement." Catherine inclined her head, keeping her eyes appropriately downcast as a grieving widow might. "My lord, you must understand that my situation requires a certain pragmatism. I seek a marriage of convenience, not romance." "I understand completely, my lord. My own dear James has only been gone these 8 months. My heart remains with him." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "And your circumstances? Your letter mentioned investments." Catherine forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "My husband left me modestly provided for. The investments will mature shortly, though there have been some legal complications." Something flickered in the Earl's eyes, suspicion, perhaps, but it was gone in an instant. "How convenient that they should mature shortly. And might I inquire as to the approximate value of these investments?" Catherine had prepared for this question, researching what might be considered a respectable sum without being unbelievably large. "Approximately £15,000, my lord." The Earl's eyebrows rose slightly. "A fortunate provision from a lieutenant." James came from a wealthy merchant family, Catherine improvised. They disowned him when he chose the military over the family business, but his maternal uncle left him the sum upon his death. Lord Harrowby studied her for a long moment before changing tack. "You are younger than I expected." "I was married at 18, my lord. James and I had 6 years together before." She allowed her voice to trail off, hoping he would attribute any emotional display to genuine grief rather than the strain of maintaining her deception. "And you have no children?" The question struck closer to home than he could know. Catherine had always dreamed of motherhood, a dream that seemed increasingly unlikely to be fulfilled. "No, my lord. That blessing was not granted to us." "But you wish for them?" "I do." This, at least, was no lie. Very much so. Something in the Earl's expression softened minutely. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the light. I shall be direct, Mrs. Fairchild. I require a wife for two specific purposes, to provide an heir for the earldom and to bring a fortune that will stabilize the Harrowby estates. In return, I offer my name, my protection, and the position of Countess. Catherine's heart raced. She had not expected him to be so forthright about his financial needs. It made her deception all the more terrible. You speak of marriage as though it were a business transaction, my lord. He turned, his expression unreadable. Is that not what it is? Among our class, has it ever been otherwise? Perhaps not, she conceded. But even a marriage of convenience might grow into something more, with time and mutual respect. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You are a romantic, Mrs. Fairchild. I would not have expected that from a woman answering a newspaper advertisement for a husband. Catherine felt her cheeks warm. Circumstances often drive us to unexpected actions, my lord. Indeed they do. He moved closer, studying her with those penetrating eyes. Tell me about your sister. The question caught her off guard. My sister? Yes, the young girl you mentioned in your letter. Margaret, I believe? You indicated she is in your care. Catherine had included this truth in her letter, unable to fabricate a situation that would allow her to bring Margaret into her new life. She is 12 years old. Our parents are deceased, and I am her only family. And you wish her to live with us, should we come to an agreement? It is non-negotiable, my lord. I will not abandon her. He nodded, as if her answer had confirmed something for him. Loyalty to family is a trait I value, Mrs. Fairchild. Your sister would be welcome at Harrowby. Relief flooded through her. This, at least, was a hurdle overcome. I have one final question, he said, standing directly before her now. Why did you choose to respond to an advertisement rather than remarry through conventional means? A young, pretty widow with a fortune should have no shortage of suitors. Catherine had prepared for this as well. After James, I found I had little patience for the usual courtship rituals. I prefer directness, my lord. Your advertisement offered that. He studied her for a long moment, and Catherine fought the urge to fidget under his scrutiny. Finally, he nodded, apparently satisfied. Very well, Mrs. Fairchild. I believe we may suit. I propose a courtship period of 1 month, for appearance's sake, after which we shall marry quietly in the Harrowby chapel. Does this arrangement meet with your approval? Catherine felt dizzy. She had not expected matters to progress so quickly. It does, my lord. Excellent. My solicitor will draw up the marriage settlements. Once your investments mature, the funds will be transferred to the Harrowby accounts to address the most pressing debts. And there it was, the trap closing around her. Catherine knew there would be no investments, no fortune forthcoming. By the time her deception was discovered, it would be too late. They would be married, and he would be bound to her, regardless of her lies. Unless, of course, he discovered the truth before the wedding. A possibility that filled her with dread. The Earl extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Catherine placed her gloved fingers in his. His grip was firm, warm through the thin fabric. To a mutually beneficial arrangement, Mrs. Fairchild. Catherine forced a smile. To new beginnings, Lord Harrowby. What she didn't say was that those new beginnings were built on a foundation of lies that threatened to collapse at any moment. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Catherine and Margaret moved into a small but elegant suite of rooms in Harrowby House, ostensibly to allow the courting couple to become better acquainted. In reality, Catherine had been unable to pay the rent on their cottage, and the Earl had suggested the arrangement as a practical solution. Margaret, delighted by the grandeur of their new surroundings, thrived. The Earl had engaged tutors for her, fulfilling Catherine's long-held wish to provide her sister with a proper education. For this alone, Catherine's gratitude was genuine, even as her guilt intensified. Lord Harrowby, she discovered, was not the cold, calculating man she had first believed. He was reserved, certainly, and often preoccupied with estate matters, but he showed unexpected kindnesses, ensuring Margaret's favourite desserts appeared at dinner, providing Catherine with access to the extensive Harrowby library, even arranging for a pianoforte to be moved to their sitting room when he learned of Margaret's love for music. One evening, a week before the wedding, Catherine found him in the library, poring over ledgers by lamplight. She had been avoiding him, knowing that each interaction was an opportunity for her deception to be discovered, but tonight, her conscience would not allow her to retreat. "My lord," she said softly. He looked up, surprise evident in his features. "Mrs. Fairchild. Is something amiss?" "No. I simply—" She hesitated, then crossed to stand beside him. "I wish to thank you for your kindness to Margaret. The new art supplies you sent up today made her quite ecstatic." A smile softened his usually stern countenance. "She is a bright child. It would be a crime not to nurture such talent." Catherine's throat tightened with emotion. "Nevertheless, your thoughtfulness exceeds our arrangement." He set down his pen, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Does it? I had not realized our arrangement precluded basic human decency." "Of course not. I only meant—" "I know what you meant." He rose, towering over her. "You expected a cold, mercenary transaction. Perhaps that is what I intended initially, but I find myself unexpectedly invested in your sister's welfare. And in yours." Catherine took a step back, unnerved by his proximity and the warmth in his voice. "Lord Harrowby, Kieran," he corrected. "If we are to be married in a week's time, you might begin using my given name." "Kieran," she repeated, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. "I fear I have not been entirely forthcoming with you." His expression shuttered. "Regarding what matter?" The truth hovered on her lips. "I am not a widow. There is no fortune. I lied to save my sister from destitution." But the words would not come. Not yet. Not when Margaret was finally safe and happy. "My feelings," she said instead. "This arrangement has become more than I anticipated." It was not the confession she had intended, but it was no less true. Despite her efforts to maintain emotional distance, she found herself drawn to the complex man before her, his integrity, his commitment to his family legacy, his unexpected gentleness with Margaret. Something flickered in his eyes, hope, perhaps, or wariness. In what way? Catherine struggled to articulate what she barely understood herself. "I find myself caring for you. Not as part of our arrangement, but as a man. A good man." He reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Catherine." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sent a shiver through her. "Yes? I must confess something as well." His voice was low, intimate. "I chose you from among several responses to my advertisement not because your letter suggested the largest fortune, but because you were the only one who mentioned a dependent sister. It spoke of a capacity for love and sacrifice that I found compelling." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. His words only deepened her shame. "You give me too much credit." "I think not." His thumb gently wiped away a tear that had escaped. "Whatever your secrets, Catherine, and I suspect there are many, I believe in your love for your sister. It is that capacity for love that I hope might one day extend to me, and to our children." The mention of children, heirs he expected her to provide, was a painful reminder of her deception. She pulled away, unable to bear his tenderness when it was based on lies. "It grows late," she said, her voice unsteady. "I should check on Margaret." He let his hand fall, his expression closing once more. "Of course. Good night, Catherine." As she fled the library, Catherine knew she could not continue this charade. She must tell him the truth, even if it meant losing everything. The question was whether she had the courage to do so before it was too late. The day before the wedding arrived with unseasonable rain that matched Catherine's turbulent emotions. She had resolved to confess all to Lord Harrowby, Kieran, immediately after breakfast, but he had been called away to meet with his solicitor about the marriage settlements. Settlements that detailed the transfer of her non-existent fortune. As noon approached with no sign of his return, Catherine paced the drawing room, rehearsing explanations that sounded increasingly inadequate. How did one apologize for a deception of this magnitude? The sound of carriage wheels on gravel drew her to the window. Not Kieran's carriage, but a hired hack. A visitor? Few called at Harrowby House these days, as the Earl's financial difficulties were widely rumoured in society. Minutes later, the butler appeared at the drawing-room door. "A Miss Amberley to see you, madam." Catherine's stomach dropped. Miss Amberley was Margaret's music teacher from the village, a woman who knew her as Miss Fairchild, not the widowed Mrs. Fairchild. "Show her in, please," Catherine said faintly. Miss Amberley swept into the room, her expression brightening at the sight of Catherine. "Miss Fairchild! I was so concerned when I called at the cottage and found you gone. The landlord said you had departed in some haste." Catherine glanced anxiously at the butler, who remained impassively by the door. "Thank you, Burton. That will be all." Once the door closed, Catherine turned to her visitor. "Miss Amberley, I'm afraid there's been some confusion. I am Mrs. Fairchild, not Miss." The older woman's brow furrowed. "Mrs.? But surely, oh." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You've married? My dear, why didn't you tell me? And who is the fortunate gentleman?" "It's complicated," Catherine said weakly. "Please, won't you sit? I'll ring for tea." As they settled onto the settee, Catherine's mind raced. She needed to prevent Miss Amberley from mentioning her unmarried state to anyone in the household, especially Margaret, who might innocently contradict the story Catherine had crafted. "Miss Amberley, I must ask for your discretion. My marriage was irregular. For Margaret's sake, I would prefer it not be discussed." The music teacher's eyes widened with scandalized delight. "An elopement? My dear Mrs. Fairchild, or should I say, Mrs. "The name remains Fairchild," Catherine said hastily. "And yes, something of that nature." Now, about Margaret's lessons, the drawing-room door opened, and Catherine's heart stopped as Kieran entered, his tall figure imposing in formal attire. "Catherine, I've returned from," he paused, noticing their visitor. "My apologies. I didn't realize you had company." Miss Amberley rose, curiosity evident in her expression. "Lord Harrowby." "I had no idea, miss, that is, Mrs. Fairchild was acquainted with your lordship." Kieran's gaze sharpened, moving between the women. "Indeed. Mrs. Fairchild and I are well acquainted. In fact, we are to be married tomorrow." Miss Amberley's jaw dropped. "Married?" But she glanced at Catherine, whose face had drained of all colour. "That is, I mean to say, congratulations." An uncomfortable silence fell. Kieran's expression had hardened, his eyes cold as they fixed on Catherine. "Miss Amberley, I wonder if you might look in on Margaret," Catherine said desperately. "She's practicing in the music room and would be delighted to see you." "Oh. Yes, of course." The music teacher glanced between them once more, clearly sensing the tension. "Congratulations again, my lord." "Mrs. Fairchild." As soon as the door closed behind Miss Amberley, Kieran turned to Catherine, his voice dangerously calm. "Would you care to explain why your former music teacher seems confused about your marital status?" Catherine's hands trembled. The moment she had dreaded had arrived. "Kieran, I can explain." "Then do so. Now." His tone left no room for equivocation. She sank onto the settee, the strength suddenly gone from her legs. "I am not a widow. I have never been married." His expression did not change, but she saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. "And the investments?" "The £15,000. Don't exist." The words were barely audible. There is no fortune, no Lieutenant James Fairchild. It was all a fabrication. Kieran turned away, his posture rigid. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the silence was more terrible than any anger could have been. Why? He finally asked, his back still to her. Catherine closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. We were about to be evicted. Margaret and I would have been separated, she to an orphanage, I to whatever position I could secure. When I saw your advertisement, I thought it was our only hope. He turned then, his expression unreadable. So you constructed an elaborate lie to entrap me into marriage? Yes. There was no point in denying it. I convinced myself it was justified, for Margaret's sake. But the longer I knew you, the more unbearable the deception became. Were you planning to tell me? Or would I have discovered the truth only after we were irrevocably bound together? I was going to tell you today, she whispered. Before the wedding. I swear it. A convenient claim, now that you've been exposed. His voice was cold, cutting. Tell me, Miss Fairchild, what did you imagine would happen once we were married? Did you think I wouldn't notice when the promised fortune failed to materialize? I thought. She faltered, seeing the full extent of her naivete. I hoped that by then, you might have developed enough regard for me, for us, that it wouldn't matter. He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. You hoped to manipulate not only my finances but my emotions as well. How very thorough. No. Catherine rose, reaching for him instinctively. It wasn't like that. I never meant. He stepped back, avoiding her touch. Enough. I've heard sufficient lies from you to last a lifetime. The finality in his tone broke something in Catherine. What happens now? Now. His smile was grim. Now you will pack your belongings and those of your sister, and you will leave Harrowby House. I shall provide a modest sum to secure lodgings elsewhere, consider it compensation for the inconvenience of having your scheme disrupted. Kieran, please. She was begging now, pride abandoned. I know I've wronged you terribly, but Margaret should not have been used as a pawn in your game, he interrupted harshly. Do not attempt to use her again to manipulate my sympathy. Catherine flinched as if struck. I deserve your contempt, but she is innocent in all this. A fact you might have considered before enmeshing her in your web of deceit. He moved to the door, his hand on the knob. You have until nightfall to depart. I cannot bear to look at you a moment longer than necessary. As the door closed behind him with quiet finality, Catherine sank to her knees, sobs racking her body. She had gambled everything on this deception and lost not only her future security but also the respect and affection of a man she had come to care for deeply. Worse still, she had failed Margaret, the one person she had sworn to protect at all costs. Kieran stalked through the corridors of Harrowby House, fury and betrayal coursing through him. In the library, he slammed the door and poured himself a generous measure of brandy, downing it in one burning gulp before hurling the glass into the fireplace. The crash and tinkle of shattered crystal offered momentary satisfaction, but did nothing to ease the hollowness in his chest. How could he have been so thoroughly deceived? He, who prided himself on his judgment of character. My lord? His butler's voice came from the doorway, concerned but discreet. Leave me, Kieran growled. Yes, my lord. But there is a Mr. Willoughby here to see you regarding the marriage settlements. The marriage settlements. For a wedding that would never take place. Kieran laughed bitterly. Send him in. When the solicitor entered, documents in hand, Kieran was standing at the window, staring unseeing at the rain-lashed gardens. My lord, I've finalized that there will be no wedding, Willoughby, Kieran interrupted flatly. The bride-to-be has proven herself a liar and a fraud. The solicitor's expression registered shock, then dismay. I see. Might I inquire as to the nature of the deception? She is not a widow. There is no fortune. The entire arrangement was a calculated attempt to secure her future at my expense. Willoughby's brow furrowed. That is most distressing, my lord. However, I must remind you that without this marriage, or another advantageous alliance arranged quickly, Harrowby faces imminent financial collapse. You think I don't know that? Kieran's voice rose in frustration. But what would you have me do? Marry a woman who has lied about every aspect of her identity? Who intended to trick me into providing for her and her sister without fulfilling her part of the bargain? Perhaps not, my lord. But I feel compelled to ask, what will become of the young lady and her sister? If, as you say, there is no fortune. Kieran waved a dismissive hand. I've instructed her to leave by nightfall. I'll provide enough money to secure modest lodgings. Very generous, under the circumstances, Willoughby murmured. And the child? The sister. What of her? Nothing, my lord. Only that it seems a pity. From what you had told me previously, she showed great promise. Talented, you said. Bright. Kieran scowled. Do not attempt to manipulate me, Willoughby. Miss Fairchild has done enough of that already. Of course not, my lord. I merely observe that the child is innocent of her sister's deception. Kieran turned away, unwilling to acknowledge the truth in the solicitor's words. Margaret's face flashed in his mind, her delight when he had gifted her the art supplies, her solemn concentration at the pianoforte, her shy smile when he had complimented her watercolors. The matter is closed, he said firmly. Now, what news of the creditors? As Willoughby outlined the increasingly dire financial situation, Kieran found his thoughts returning to Catherine. Not the false widow she had pretended to be, but the woman he had come to know, fiercely protective of her sister, intelligent, capable of surprising insights into his own character. Had it all been an act? The warmth in her eyes when she spoke to him, the genuine care she showed for the aging servants, her thoughtful questions about the estate's operations, had these, too, been calculated to earn his trust? My lord? Willoughby was staring at him expectantly. I apologize. You were saying. I was asking if you wish me to inform Lady Pembroke that you might be receptive to her daughter's suit after all. Miss Pembroke's fortune is substantial, though perhaps not as large as that is, Miss Fairchild's purported inheritance. Kieran pictured Miss Pembroke, pretty, vapid, interested only in the latest fashions and social gossip. The thought of spending his life with such a woman, even to save Harrowby, suddenly seemed intolerable. Not yet, he said abruptly. There is something I must attend to first. Leaving the confused solicitor behind, Kieran strode through the house toward the east wing where Catherine and Margaret had been housed. He was not entirely certain what he intended to say or do, only that he could not let them leave without what? Further recriminations? Forgiveness? He did not know. As he approached their suite, he heard music, Margaret at the pianoforte, playing a melancholy Chopin nocturne with surprising skill for one so young. He paused outside the door, listening, and then heard Catherine's voice. That's beautiful, darling, but we must pack. We're leaving today. But why? Margaret's voice was plaintive. I thought we were staying here. I thought you were going to marry Lord Harrowby. There's been a change of plans. Lord Harrowby has discovered that I am not what he thought. You mean that you're not really a widow? The innocent question froze Kieran in place. I never understood why you pretended that, Cathy. You knew. Catherine sounded stunned. Of course I knew. Margaret's tone was matter-of-fact. Papa died 3 years ago, and you never married anyone. I may be young, but I'm not stupid. Why didn't you say anything? Because you were trying so hard to protect me. You always do. And Lord Harrowby seemed nice. I thought maybe he wouldn't mind that you weren't really a widow, if he got to know you. A soft sob. Oh, Meggie. I've made such a terrible mess of everything. Lord Harrowby is furious, and rightfully so. I lied to him, betrayed his trust. But you love him, Margaret said simply. I can tell. And I think he loves you too. No, darling. He may have been developing feelings, but now there's only contempt. Kieran's chest tightened at the raw pain in her voice. Will we go back to the cottage? No, we can't. But Lord Harrowby is giving us enough money to find new lodgings. We'll be all right. And then what? Will you become a governess? If I can. It may be difficult to secure a position after this scandal. I could work too, Margaret offered earnestly. I'm old enough to be a maid somewhere. Absolutely not. Catherine's voice was fierce. You will continue your education, somehow. I'll find a way. The determination in her tone, the same determination that had led her to concoct such an audacious scheme to protect her sister, struck Kieran forcefully. It was wrong-headed, certainly. Dishonest, unquestionably. But it had come from a place of desperate love, not malice. He thought of his own father, gambling away the family fortune while maintaining an outward appearance of prosperity. That, too, had been a deception, one that had left Kieran to bear the consequences. Yet his father had acted from selfishness, not sacrifice. Catherine had lied to provide for her sister, not herself. She had been willing to bind herself to a stranger, to bear his children, to fulfill all the duties of a countess, not for personal gain but to secure Margaret's future. It did not excuse her actions, but it cast them in a different light. Before he could reconsider, Kieran knocked sharply on the door. The music stopped abruptly. After a moment, Catherine opened the door, her face pale and streaked with tears. She straightened when she saw him, squaring her shoulders as if preparing for further condemnation. Lord Harrowby. We are nearly packed. We shall be gone within the hour. I've reconsidered, he said without preamble. You will stay. Catherine blinked in confusion. Stay. Yes. The wedding will proceed as planned tomorrow. But, why? After what I've done, how can you possibly? I have my reasons, he interrupted. Chief among them being that I require a wife and an heir, and you need a home and security for your sister. Our original arrangement can still serve those purposes, even without the fortune you fabricated. Hope and wariness warred in Catherine's expression. You would still marry me, knowing I lied. I would marry you knowing why you lied, he corrected. But understand this, Catherine, there must be no more deception between us. Not ever. I require absolute honesty from this moment forward. Yes, of course. She hesitated, searching his face. But your financial situation, without my supposed fortune, how will you save Harrowby? I will find another way. Timber from the northern estate, perhaps. Or the racehorse breeding program my grandfather began and my father abandoned. There are possibilities. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but these were different from before, tears of relief, of gratitude, perhaps even of joy. I don't deserve this second chance. Perhaps not. His voice softened slightly. But Margaret does. And I find I have become attached to the idea of having you both in my life. Lord Harrowby, Kieran, I don't know what to say. Then say nothing for now. He glanced past her to where Margaret stood, watching them with hopeful eyes. Miss Margaret, I understand you've been practicing Chopin. Would you play for me? The girl's face lit up. Yes, my lord. As Margaret returned to the pianoforte, Kieran stepped closer to Catherine, his voice pitched for her ears alone. This will not be easy, Catherine. Trust, once broken, is not quickly rebuilt. But I am willing to try if you are. I am, she whispered fervently. I will spend every day proving myself worthy of your trust, your name, your... She faltered. My what? He prompted. Your heart, she finished, a flush coloring her cheeks. If that is ever possible. Kieran studied her face, the sincerity in her blue eyes, the tremulous curve of her lips, the hope and fear mingling in her expression. Despite everything, he found himself wanting to believe in her, in the possibility of what they might build together. We shall see, he said, his tone gentler than it had been all day. For now, let us listen to your sister play. As Margaret's music filled the room, Kieran and Catherine stood side by side, not touching but connected nonetheless by the fragile thread of a second chance, an opportunity to transform a union founded on deception into something true and lasting. The wedding took place the following day as planned, though with considerably less pomp than originally intended. Catherine wore a simple ivory gown rather than the elaborate white satin that had been commissioned, feeling it more appropriate given the circumstances. The ceremony in the Harrowby chapel was attended only by Margaret, Mr. Willoughby, and a handful of servants. When Catherine spoke her vows, promising to love, honour, and cherish Kieran, she did so with complete sincerity, determined that this, at least, would be no lie. Kieran's expression remained guarded throughout, but when he placed the Harrowby family ring on her finger, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had belonged to his mother, his hands were gentle, and his eyes held a warmth that gave Catherine hope. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of tentative steps toward understanding. True to his word, Kieran began exploring ways to restore Harrowby's fortunes without Catherine's fictional inheritance. He reopened the stables, investing in the bloodlines his grandfather had established, and contracted for selective timber harvesting from the northern estate. Catherine, for her part, threw herself into learning the duties of a countess. She worked closely with the housekeeper to reduce household expenses without sacrificing quality, reorganized the kitchen gardens to provide more produce for the house, and took a personal interest in the tenant families, establishing a small school for their children where Margaret often helped teach music and drawing. They developed a routine of sorts. Breakfast together with Margaret, separate pursuits during the day, dinner as a family, and evenings in the library where Kieran would often read aloud while Catherine sewed and Margaret sketched. It was a peaceful existence, if not yet the loving marriage Catherine had come to hope for. Their physical relationship remained unconsummated, Kieran having explained quietly on their wedding night that he would not rush that aspect of their marriage until trust had been more firmly established. Catherine had accepted his decision with outward grace, though it pained her more than she could express. Then came the night, some 2 months after their wedding, when Catherine woke to the sound of Kieran calling out in his sleep. They occupied adjoining bedchambers, connected by a door that remained carefully closed each night. Now, concerned, she rose and entered his room without thinking. He was thrashing in his bed, clearly in the grip of a nightmare. "Father, no! The estate, you cannot!" "Kieran," she called softly, approaching the bed. "Kieran, wake up!" His eyes flew open, disoriented and haunted. "Catherine!" "You were dreaming," she explained, perching cautiously on the edge of the bed. "About your father, I think." He ran a hand over his face, collecting himself. "I apologize if I disturbed you." "Don't apologize." Do you have these nightmares often?" "Occasionally." He sat up, the bedcovers pooling around his waist, his chest bare in the moonlight. "More frequently since inheriting the title." Catherine hesitated, then placed her hand gently over his. "Would you like to talk about it?" For a moment, she thought he would refuse, retreat behind the careful politeness that still characterized much of their interaction. Instead, he sighed deeply. "I dream that I am watching my father gamble away Harrowby piece by piece, the lands, the art, the very stones of the house itself. I try to stop him, but I cannot move or speak. I can only watch as everything disappears." "And then you wake up to find that it's not entirely a dream," Catherine said softly. "That he did leave you with a crumbling legacy." "Yes." His fingers curled around hers, seemingly without conscious thought. "I was so angry with him when I discovered the extent of his debts. I still am, in many ways. But lately, I've come to understand him better." "How so?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his thumb absently stroking the back of her hand. "He was unhappy. My mother died when I was young, and he never recovered from the loss. The gambling, the drinking, they were escapes from a life that had become intolerable to him." "That doesn't excuse what he did to you, to the estate," Catherine pointed out gently. "No. But understanding helps, somehow." He turned to look at her directly, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen. "Just as understanding why you lied doesn't excuse the deception, but it makes forgiveness possible." Catherine's breath caught. Forgiveness. I do forgive you, Catherine. His voice was low, sincere. I realized something tonight, watching you sleep before I woke you. Despite how our marriage began, you have shown nothing but honesty and commitment since. You've worked tirelessly for Harrowby, for Margaret, for me. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes. I never expected to care for you as I do. When I answered that advertisement, I thought only of security, of a roof over our heads. But now, he prompted, his eyes intent on hers. Now I cannot imagine a life without you. Not because of Harrowby or your title, but because of who you are, honorable, kind, stronger than you know. Kieran reached up, cupping her cheek in his palm. I fought against my feelings for you. After the deception was revealed, I told myself that anything I felt was based on a lie, that it couldn't be real. And now, she whispered, hardly daring to hope. Now I know that what I feel for you is entirely real, entirely true. I love you, Catherine. Not the fiction you created, but the woman you truly are. A sob of joy escaped her. I love you too. So much that it frightens me sometimes. Don't be frightened. His arms encircled her, drawing her against his chest. We've weathered the worst already. From here, we build our life together, honestly, openly, with all our flaws and strengths laid bare. When his lips met hers, it was a kiss of promise, of forgiveness, of a future neither of them had anticipated but both now embraced wholeheartedly. 1 year later, Catherine sat in the nursery, watching as Kieran cradled their newborn son in his arms. The baby, barely a week old, had his father's dark hair and, Catherine was certain, his thoughtful expression. His perfect, Kieran murmured, a sense of wonder in his voice that had not diminished since the child's birth. Of course he is, Margaret said pragmatically, looking up from her sketchbook where she was attempting to capture the scene. At 13, she had blossomed under the stability and education Harrowby provided, her artistic talents particularly flourishing. He's a Harrowby. Indeed he is. Kieran smiled at his sister-in-law, then at Catherine. James Edward Ivingston, Viscount Fernley, and future Earl of Harrowby. Catherine's heart swelled at the name they had chosen, James for the fictional husband she had invented, transformed now into a legacy of truth for their son, and Edward for Kieran's father, an acknowledgement that even flawed legacies deserved remembrance. The past year had brought many changes to Harrowby. The timber harvesting had provided enough capital to satisfy the most pressing creditors, while the horse breeding program was beginning to show promise. The house itself felt different, warmer, more lived in, filled with music from Margaret's pianoforte and laughter from the growing circle of friends Catherine had cautiously cultivated among the local gentry. Most significant, however, was the change in their marriage. The walls of mistrust had crumbled slowly at first, then with increasing speed as Catherine and Kieran discovered in each other not just passion but genuine partnership. They argued occasionally, Catherine's impulsiveness sometimes clashing with Kieran's caution, but always found their way back to understanding. "What are you thinking?" Kieran asked softly, noticing her contemplative expression. "I was thinking about how differently things might have turned out," she admitted. "If you hadn't forgiven me, if I hadn't answered that advertisement. Then we would not have this," he said simply, gesturing to encompass the baby in his arms, Margaret with her sketching, the refurbished nursery around them. "And it is worth everything that came before." Catherine rose, moving to stand beside her husband and child. "The Earl needed an heir," she murmured. "And you needed a home," he finished, echoing words from their past. "But we found so much more than either of us sought." "Love," Margaret supplied helpfully, not looking up from her drawing. "You found love. It's terribly romantic, even if it did start with a scandalous lie." Catherine laughed, exchanging an amused glance with Kieran. "Yes, well, perhaps we'll present a slightly edited version of events to James when he's older." "I don't know," Kieran mused, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "It's rather a good story. The desperate spinster, the financially strapped Earl, the convenient fabrication. And the happily ever after," Catherine added, leaning up to press a kiss to his lips. "Don't forget the most important part." As their son stirred between them, tiny fists waving in the air, Catherine reflected that their story, unconventional, difficult, ultimately triumphant, was indeed worth telling. Not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that even from the most unpromising beginnings, with honesty and courage, something beautiful could grow. The Earl had needed an heir, and she had needed a home. What neither had expected was that love would make them whole.